Today, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite rhythms in the world, and that is Samba from Brazil. And more specifically, I'd like to speak about the Surdo Primeira. Surdo being this bass drum, and Surdo Primeira is usually translated as the first surdo or the surdo one. But I like to also think of it as, in English, the primary surdo, because it's giving us the primary feeling of the music, which is an accent on the second count. So if you're counting 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, it's giving us that accent on the second count. Now that's the primary feeling of samba, because samba evolved from the marching rhythms of Brazil, older rhythms that comes from Brazil. When you look at things like frevo, and it's often called quadrilha or fanfarra. In these marching rhythms, you have the same thing. You have that same accentuation on the second count, right? So samba has that in common with it, and it's particularly strong in the style that I'm going to talk about today, which is samba enredo. It's a bit different in other styles of samba, namely samba afro or samba reggae. The accent on the first beat is a little bit stronger. So you've got now that strong feeling on the first beat is something that's very typically African, right? So in African rhythms, you generally find that the first beat is often accentuated quite strongly. So Samba Afro has that little bit of a different feeling in it, that the first beat is a bit stronger. It's like, but in samba, in what I'm talking about today, samba enredo, we definitely got that stronger feeling on the second beat. Okay, so that's a little bit of context about why we're calling it the Surdo Primeira. Now, after that, I just want to talk a little bit about the other surdos that go into the bateria. So you've got the first surdo, then you've got usually the second surdo, which I like to call that the resposta. It's the response, right? So if we've got the count being accentuated on the 2 with the Surdo Primeira, the resposta or the response plays the first beat of the bar. So if you call them surdo 1 and 2, it gets a bit confusing because the surdo 1 is playing the second beat and the surdo 2 is playing the first. So that's why I prefer to call it the Surdo Primeira and the resposta, the primary surdo and the response. Primary being the second beat and the response is on the first. Okay, so there's our first 2 surdos in the bateria, and then we've got the third one. The third one is playing, usually it's starting with playing the same beat as the Surdo Primeira, but then it's extending the phrase. It's like adding to it and it's syncopating away from it. But primarily, the important thing to know is that in samba, the Surdo Primeira, the primary surdo, is the pivot point of the whole rhythm. So everybody is pivoting around this beat, the second beat of the count. So 1, boom, doom, bakachiki, boom, boom, bakachiki, boom, doom, bakachiki, boom, boom, bakachiki, boom, doom, bakachiki, boom. And also it's called Surdo Primeira because usually it's the first surdo to enter into the rhythm. It's the first surdo to start the rhythm. Okay, so that's a little bit talking about our Surdo Primeira. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about how we play it with technique. Now, one of the things about samba enredo, or the carnival style of samba which I'm talking about, is it's a lot more rigid than some other styles of samba, such as samba afro, where dancing is a big part of their style. But in the Samba Enredo, in this style, I'm going to talk about, it's more rigid, right? Now this is really important in a Samba Enredo style, because you have big baterias, really big drumming groups, and everybody's depending on the Surdo Primeira and the resposta, the response, to keep the time, to mark the time really well. So there's a few little tips that I'd like to give about how we do this the best way. The first one, right, is like when you strike with the beater, it comes down, you freeze into this position. Now when you kind of freeze, you kind of pause, the fingers lock, they hold the beater tight so that it doesn't start rising up again, because you want to hold this position straight away. That's going to help you with the marking of the time, right? Because when the beater comes down, it comes down direct, straight, and you pause. And then when you're going to go back up, you go back up in one movement, right? So it's just two movements. One is down and one is up. One is down, one is up, right? So that's that rigid thing is going to help you mark the time. So you're going to be like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So a big, very common problem that happens in baterias is that because this isn't being marked so well, the security of the bateria is compromised, because the first and the second surdo are a little bit too wishy-washy, right? So if you play it and the stick is like rising up before the next beat, the marking of the time is not so precise, right? So to be precise, to be a little bit more rigid, is going to help the whole bateria stick together and be uniform, right? So when the beater goes down, the fingers hold it tight, and then when it comes back up, so down and then up, and down and up. And in between each strike, I'm like holding still. That's helping me concentrate on keeping good time. 1, right? So if the count is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You see how I kind of freeze, there's a little pause, right? So when the beater comes down, there's a little pause, and I grab it with my fingers. And as it comes up here, I can relax a little bit with my fingers. The other thing is, you don't want to be always coming up here. You don't always necessarily have to be striking really hard. The Surdo Primeira is giving a lot of the dynamic, right? The Surdo Primeira has to be very sensitive to the bateria. So if you're always playing up here, you're always going to be playing loud. But that's not necessarily what you want. Sometimes you might want to just be playing a little bit softer. And so to get a softer sound, try to bring your beater less high, and just here is fine. For example, I can play softly like from here. So this is especially important if the bateria is fairly small. If it's a small bateria, you don't want to overwhelm the whole bateria by playing too loud. So it's important not to rise up too high with the bateria, with the baqueta, with the beater, right? So when we play softly, we don't need to rise all the way up here, because if you come up here every time, you're always going to play loud. Sometimes you don't need to always play loud, okay? So that's a contextual thing. It really depends on the moment, what's happening. If you're in the heat of the moment and it's full power, then sure, go for it. But I would say it's excellent to have a Surdo Primeira who is very sensitive to dynamic and doesn't always play too loudly. So I think that's about enough for today. Speaking about the Surdo Primeira, I've been talking about it for 10 minutes. So that'll do for today. Hopefully that's helpful to people, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.